All right, so we just talked about assumptions. Basically, assumptions are your enemies, and moving from there. So that's something to stay away from. Like you want to be educated, but moving from there, I wanted to just really quickly touch on touchy subjects. Maybe these, yeah. So I'm not going to say anything about touchy subjects except that you stay away from them. And key examples of touchy subjects is religious beliefs. Not everybody shares the same religious beliefs as you do, so more than likely, unless you're in a religious setting, you probably shouldn't mention those. Same thing with politics, unless you're like actually a constituent running for something, you probably want to stay away from politics, because again, these are things that almost immediately create a barrier. They might endear you, because you do want to, like, you want the audience to embrace you, in a sense, but again, if it's not, you're not specifically at a religious gathering or specifically at a political gathering, the moment you say, well, actually I'm a Democrat, or even you just slip up and make a joke about President Obama, somebody in the audience would be like, oh, okay, so he thinks this. And then it's almost like cross their arms, they shut out and aren't listening to you anymore. So aside from that, other polarizing issues. So that kind of goes with what we just talked about in terms of just keeping up with the times and just kind of knowing what's happening, especially knowing what's happening in that area. So right now, two things that are discussed a lot in the news are homosexuality, with laws about homosexuality being passed, and then also right now there's the Baltimore riots. So again, things like that, there's very few ways that you can bring those things up without immediately somebody feeling some kind of emotion that might actually be negative or not beneficial. So be very selective about those. And in regards to touchy subjects altogether, if all else fails, use a disclaimer. So if you're going to say a statement that might steer you one way or another religiously, use a disclaimer to just say, I'm not saying this is what I am, or I'm not trying to put down this group. Like, say you're bringing up a statistic about religion or about politics. You say that I'm just using this statistic for the benefit of my study. You just put that disclaimer beforehand, so you don't offend anybody. That makes sense. So from there, I had made a point about internationals, but ladies already touched on that pretty well. And again, for me, as a Zimbabwean, I think that's a big thing, but it just comes down to, again, being sensitive. Aside from the things that we've already mentioned about communicating with internationals, the one thing I will touch on is body language. So that's worth considering. What do certain gestures mean? Because it's easy to stay away from saying certain things, but you also maybe, if you're on a business trip to Tokyo, don't assume because you saw in this movie some Asian people bowing when they greeted each other that every part of Asia they bow before they greet each other, something like that, like learn what that means, especially for classes and just for who you could offend if you do that the wrong way. So the final two things I wanted to touch on are just communicating to older people, which are seniors, and communicating to younger people. First, I'll just touch on seniors. When you're presenting, say, for example, you have something that you're having to show in an old people home, in a retirement home, or just in a place where you notice, okay, there's a good amount of old people here. You want to be sensitive and make that adjustment. Hopefully you can do that beforehand if you already know that you're going to be dealing with seniors, to, like we talked about before we filmed this, to, one, have very clear audio. You have a microphone, make sure your microphone's good, but even when you're speaking, make sure you're actually enunciating. And this is where maybe taking out that slang, or considering if you speak with slang or you speak with an accent, or if you are generally around college students a lot, okay, now you're approaching people who are twice as old. So yeah, take your language into consideration there. Visuals, I think something that's really cool to look up if you're ever going to be in this position of presenting to older people is just Google the word semiotics, which is the study of signs. Basically, semiotics is real big at airports, for example. Maybe you notice or you never noticed that you go to an airport, there's people from all over the world at an international airport, there's people from all kinds of demographics. And things have to be communicated at an airport with very little actual English or very little language. It's more about the sign. So if I'm going to show a graphic that says airplane, or if I'm going to show a graphic that says drink, it's probably going to be plain color, big and bold, and that's it. Nothing fancy. Something that a young person, middle-aged person, older person can immediately click to. So yeah, just keeping your visuals plain. And just a final thing is dealing with older people. Stay away from cliche jokes, like don't tell them back in my day or whatever, because somebody's probably not going to appreciate that. Yeah, and the very last thing that I wanted to touch on was communicating with younger people. And the three main things I had for that was one, just realize the attention span for younger people is probably going to be a little different than the attention span for people our age or people in their 20s and 30s. So keep that in mind when you're planning your notes to say, okay, I probably need to only take up 10, 15 minutes because that's all they're really going to listen to. And especially consider what time of the day is it. Are they going to listen to me in the morning? Did they just come out of school and now I'm telling them all this? So attention span is a big thing. And another big thing too when communicating with younger people, teenagers maybe not as much, but definitely toddlers, 5, 10 years old, is that you have to command the room, like you have to control it. They're probably going to be distracted, they're probably going to be playing with things or whatever. So you want to be authority in the room, but you don't want to be demeaning. You don't want them to start feeling like you're imposing on them or doing anything that kind of sets a barrier. And the last thing that I had for communicating with young people is just like semiotics and visuals and signs and stuff can be very helpful with older people. The same thing can be effective for young people, especially really young people, bright colors, cartoon characters that they're familiar with. But another big thing, especially teenagers are moving up, is at the beginning of the presentation, if you need an icebreaker, throw on a YouTube video of some really funny stuff, because they probably spend all day watching that stuff anyways. You can put that in there, and you can even maybe find some vines that have to do with the latest dance, and they're going to connect to that, especially if your presentation has something to do with music or dancing or whatever. So keep those visuals and video and audio cues in mind when communicating. But for that, I wanted to give Caleb an opportunity to just kind of, I guess you can introduce yourself, talk about your work experience.
Great. Yeah, I'm Caleb. I've worked in housing for 3 years now, 2.5 in the dorms, and then now a semester, half a year in another dorm, just doing a different job. And I would say in a presentation or a teaching setting, the two things I would recommend are audience involvement and relatability. And so for that, just finding a way for them to be engaged in it and feel like they're having some kind of an influence on what they're learning. And then finding out ahead of time what they actually like to do, instead of just assuming like kids like this, and you may be a little bit off on the age group and what they're actually doing. So asking people ahead of time that are going to give you an honest answer in that age group about what they would want to see or what they would learn about. And in a personal setting, I would say familiarity and consistency would back up your credibility about the things that you're saying, and just kind of help them to believe and care about what you're saying, and also look into what personal needs they have and communicate with that in mind.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That's really helpful. So that's really it. Everything, well, you guys have handouts that have some of these points in a little more detail, but everything can really be boiled down to my very first point, which is just, if you want to communicate to a diverse audience, become the audience. So diversify your experience, your language, your research, just what you talk about, how you talk, and yeah, just constantly consider them as you consider what it is you're trying to tell them or talk to them about. Cool?
Be one with the people.
Yeah, thank you guys. All right, y'all.